Okay, this is from Sarah Kim's. She says, "Hello, Pastor. The evangelicals teach that the Sabbath day was a sign for the Sinaitic covenant, just as circumcision was for the Abrahamic covenant. Therefore, the Sabbath is not binding today since we have rest in Jesus, as it's indicated in Hebrews 4." They also refer to Colossians 2, verses 16 and 17 to claim the seventh day Sabbath is not binding today. So I guess she's asking, how would you address this?
I can't tell how many times I've run across this. Colossians 2, 16 and 17, and Hebrews 4, there's rest in Jesus. Yes, there's rest in Jesus, which is rest from sin. Okay, let's look at the Sabbath as given to the Jews. The Sabbath was given to the Jews, entrusted to the Jews to be given to the whole world. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The Sabbath was introduced to Adam and Eve. Are you with me? To Adam and Eve. Genesis 2 from verse 1, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished and all the hosts of them. On the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made," and 2 and 3 of Genesis chapter 2. Now, when God presented the Sabbath to Adam and Eve, they were the population of the world. There were no Jews. The population of the world was 2. We don't need 8 billion people to have a population. There's a population of 2, and they were to replenish the earth. The Sabbath was given to the world. Jesus is very clear. Jesus was a Jew, but here's what he said. The Sabbath was made for man. That's what Jesus said, not man for the Sabbath. So Christ himself, who was a Jew, the finest Jew you can find was Jesus. He said the Sabbath was made for man. Now, if you read the 4th commandment, I'll go through it, Exodus 28 through 11. "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work." Now listen to who should not work. "Thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates." Now the stranger also had to be aware of Sabbath keeping. But circumcision, the stranger could not take part in circumcision. If you read Exodus 12, he could not take part in circumcision. It was reserved only for Jew. He could not take part in the Passover feast. It was only reserved for circumcised Jews. But the Sabbath was for everyone, circumcised or not. You see, the stranger was not a circumcised person, so he could not take part in the Passover feast. Exodus 12 from 44 onward. But if he was in an area where there were Jews and living in their territory, he had to respect the Sabbath. And so the Sabbath then was universal. Passover was restricted. The Sabbath is universal. And so the Sabbath is not for the Jews. The Sabbath is for mankind. Now this business of Colossians 2, 14 to 16, nailed to the cross. Now, what was nailed to the cross were the ceremonial laws. If you go to Leviticus 23, in that chapter, all 7 annual feasts are listed. In Leviticus 23, in the order in which they fall: Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits, Feast of Weeks, which the New Testament calls Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles. Those are the 7 feasts. You had 4 in the spring, 3 in the fall. And they all taught the entire plan of salvation from coming to Christ, Passover, until you land in heaven, Feast of Tabernacles. Now, in that chapter, before God gives the first one, which is Passover, beginning in verse 5, he mentions the Sabbath in verse 3, which means he sets it aside. And then he says, verse 4, "These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which he shall proclaim in this season." Now, the Sabbath has no season. So long before you get to Colossians, you don't even have to get to Colossians. You look at the earlier parts of the scripture which provide guidance. The Sabbath has no season. All the other 7 feasts, not other feasts, the Sabbath is not a feast. The 7 feasts, they had seasons. Look at verse 5 of Leviticus 23. "In the 14th day of the 5th month at even is the Lord's Passover." Now, the 14th day can fall on any day of the week, like your birthday does and my birthday does. That is not the case with the Sabbath. It is not seasonal. And so while the 7 feasts represent the entire span of salvation, the Sabbath is set aside because it is not a feast. It is not a ceremonial event. It is central to the life of the saved person. When Christ died, all the 7 feasts ceased. The Sabbath did not cease. That's why Jesus said, when you're running into time of trouble, he told his listeners, when Jerusalem will be destroyed, make sure that your flight be not on the Sabbath day. And that occurred 40 years after he died. He expected them to be keeping the Sabbath. And so to say that when Christ died on the cross, he crucified the Sabbath, how then could he tell people 40 years later, be sure your flight is not on the Sabbath day? When we study the Bible, we must not bring our cherished opinions to the Bible. We must come with an open mind and let the Bible teach us. There's a fundamental opposition in people to one of the 10 commandments, a fundamental opposition, and that opposition is the Sabbath commandment. That's why it'll be the test commandment. When the Israelites came out of Egypt, in Exodus chapter 16, God tested them to see if they'd obey him generally by testing them on the 4th commandment, the Sabbath commandment, by sending manna 6 days of the week and not on the 7th. And that commandment remains the test commandment today. It is the sign between people and their God, not just the Jews, between anyone who keeps the Sabbath and God. And so the Sabbath is not a ceremonial feast. It was separated from the 7 in Leviticus 23, read verse 3, and then the 7 feasts begin in verse 5. The Sabbath is a part of God's commandments. It is no more ceremonial than thou shalt not kill. That is not ceremonial. It still exists today and required by God that we keep it, all 10.